All right then, let's kick it off. Rising from the East.
Hello. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Everyone who's here and everyone who doesn't want their Sri Lankan team to win. Well, we're fanboys, creators, geeks from India, and this is our panel's called Rising from the East. But let me get started in terms of, I mean, I'm going to hand over to Jatin very soon because you want to take over the Comic-Con part, right? Yeah. But anyway, so what we'll do is we'll give you an intro into what Indian comic books is about, the history, the background, how it all started off, and where it is now, what are the themes, what are the topics, and the new movement which has been going on for the past few years. So yeah, I mean, on my right, far right is Jatin Varma. He's the head of Comic-Con India. I have Akshay Dhar here. He runs Meta Desi Comics, and I am Aniruddho Chakraborty. I have Chariot Comics. That's my label. We sort of work together under the common label ICBM Comics. So there's that. So over to you, Jatin.
Hi. So our panel is just very basic. We'll take not too long for your time. We're just going to take you through a quick history of comics, how it started in India, where we are right now, and what the future holds. And we're also kind of similar to how the Sri Lankan scene is. We just have more people in India, so our scene is slightly bigger. So let's just start with that. Akshay is going to take you through a quick history lesson of Indian comics. Change the slide.
Hey guys, so basically we're going to start just to give you guys a really brief look at where comics started, because most people assume that comics is very much a Western thing, but we sort of took it back because in India we had comics as a visual storytelling medium, not as comics. It was just using pictures to tell a story, and we had it way back on things like paintings and all, of course, just like in ancient Egypt. But we grew up in the 60s, 70s, even in the 50s. With our parents reading comics like The Common Man, except it was more popular as a comic strip than the comics that we're used to. So what they had was mainly either religion, mythology, or just something that was a little more your slice of life and something that people can relate to. But what really picked up the comic industry was Amar Chitra Katha. You guys can make out the mythology ones in the top right corner. They actually became sort of the standard by which Indian comics were judged. And after that we saw some children's comics come into the picture, like Tinkle, like Champak, and they did well, but they were kind of restrained by the fact that they were catering to a very specific market of little kids comics. They did eventually find other comics coming in, like Diamond Comics was a company that started importing foreign comics like Flash Gordon, Mandrake the Magician, The Phantom. And those were the things that people like us grew up reading because our parents bought them, we had them, we enjoyed them. And it kind of exploded into a new way of looking at stories and looking at comics, because we didn't have cable TV to watch a lot of stuff that you could have. After that, however, there was a bit of a lull through most of the 80s, the 90s. A lot of the comic companies disappeared, or they slowed down and they kind of got stuck. But by the end of the 2000s, in the beginning, we started to see a little bit of growth with a company called Gotham Comics, who started off by licensing pretty much everything they could from DC, Marvel, Dark Horse. Next one. Yeah, you can see us. I mean, they brought everything, including Conan the Barbarian from back in the day by Robert E. Howard. And I think it actually helped a lot because for many of us, it revived an interest in comics that we didn't otherwise have access to. And thereafter, we saw a lot of people sort of getting interested with comics as a medium again. And to take from that, I'm going to just hand it over to Jatin so he can take you to what became the modern Indian comics for us.
So what Akshay took you through was basically what we had from 50s and 60s and all the way to 2000s. In addition to local stuff, we also grew up on a healthy dose of international stuff, which was limited. So we had our Phantoms, Mandrakes, we also had Tintin, Asterix, and these started coming into India in the 70s and then were republished by a lot of people. Tintin and Asterix were dubbed in different languages, and they still continue to be pretty popular. And that's what any kid that you meet in India right now, even now, would grow up reading. In addition to some of the Indian local comics, the one thing that really stuck out in India was Archie. In fact, more people in India read Archie than probably in US. That's because they used to dump their unsold stock into India, and it would be available at every street corner, every railway station. It had better distribution than any Indian comic. Even till now, in the smallest town to the biggest cities, you'll find people who know Archie and follow it and read it. And to this day, it remains something that everyone knows. Unfortunately, the TV show doesn't do that well in India, but the comics do. So, like he mentioned, 2000. In the early 2000s, we got a lot of foreign comics coming in as well. And in 2010, we started with Comic-Con India. That really blew up the comic scene. It basically put together all creators together. I actually met these guys at my first Comic-Con. I otherwise would not have never met them before. And all of us were just creating comics and trying to talk about it. This is actually the first Comic-Con we did. It was open air. It was in flea market. And second year, we even fooled some of the foreign talent out there to come down to India. That's Robert Crumb. If anyone follows indie comics anywhere, this guy is a living god. So yeah, I mean, it grew from there to, if you move ahead. Okay, just stick to it, I guess. Sorry, I missed the slide. Go back. Yeah. So the Comic-Con scene so far has been putting together indie comics, existing comics guys, international comics, and essentially selling to new buyers. In India, we don't have comic book stores. In fact, we hardly have any bookstores. So Comic-Con's become this place where people come and not only get to know about new comics, but actually buy them. The other place is just to buy it online. And what it has also done is that every few years, there's an upcycle where there's tons of new people coming in, trying to create new comics. Some do it nicely, some do it horribly. But every few years, you see new comics, and that's where what we've dubbed as the new age of Indian comics, which these guys are kind of leading with the type of comics that they do, which are very different from the humor-based strips or action stuff. These guys do thrillers, they do stuff that they would get into trouble for in India, Indian superheroes, but in a very different way. Most of the stuff that Indians usually grow up on is mythology and history, and the type of comics that are coming out now are very different. Aniruddho can take you through the stuff that these guys are putting out.
So yeah, I mean, when the new age sort of started, you know, like just around the time Comic-Con got like really active, the comic book scene, the priority has always, in terms of comic books and what's been created, has been mythology. You saw an example of Amar Chitrakatha a couple of years, which was there in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, right? So that was again driven by retelling mythological stories so that the kids kind of get to know, you know, a Rama story, a Ramayana or a Mahabharata, or even they were doing a lot of, let's say, figureheads, biographies and stuff. So so that sort of carried on. I mean, obviously there was a lull in the middle where Indian comics were not that, you know, you weren't that easily available or any of those things. And my theory is satellite TV came and killed all of that. But I don't know, not many people seem to agree with me. But yeah, so when the resurgence started, basically we decided to stick to mythology again. And this is something all of us have a problem with, but it's so deeply ingrained because those are the kind of stories we've been hearing, we've been listening to our parents tell them, our grandparents tell us, you know, those stories, and it's also sort of ingrained in the religious aspect of it. So we just sort of stick to doing that, you know, and that's all.
We also have 33 million gods, so that's a intense amount of story written already for you to play around with. So it's just easier story bank to go back to. Yeah. But if you move to the next slide, I keep dropping that. Go ahead. This is the kind of stuff that's now coming out. It's Gandhi fighting Nazi robots. Risque stuff, which Akshay puts out. Aghori, Udayan, all of these are very different. They're not really based in mythology. They do use elements of Indian contemporary life. and some historical bits, but they completely turn it around. You can give a little intro to what the comics are about.
Right. So, I mean, Akshay, you want to talk about Ground Zero?
Go ahead. Yeah. Talk about your comic.
So basically, what we got here is Ground Zero, which is so we started doing stuff like Ground Zero, which is where we started, which we tried to follow the anthology model. So we'd have a 60-page comic with about 6 different comics in them. And they were all by different artists, by different people coming together to make them. And the idea was to give people a sort of variety of stuff to read, so we could also get an idea of what people really wanted. Because for us, it was a blank slate. We had friends who read everything, but what would they actually want in a comic made here? And so that led to us producing some of the newer comics we made in the last few years, after we've had a lot of people come back at events like Comic-Con and give us feedback on what they've enjoyed. And that's actually helped develop the scene a lot, because it's created a dialogue with the people who bought and who read our comics.
So I'll quickly take you through that cover on the right, which has Jatin mentioned, has Nazi Jaegers, and it's got Gandhi and Bose and all of that. So that is Vrika. That was our flagship series when we started out in 2012. Still one of our most popular ones. So the easiest way how I explain it to anyone who is like, what's this comic about? It's more like, you know, if there was Captain America and he was sort of like Indian, you know, and he's got a team of G.I. Joes going for it, but that's just the start of it. And so Vrika obviously became really popular. It's got its following because it's fun, you know, in terms of it's got that action adventure thing going. And it also segues into a lot of, I would say, historical and political thriller territory. So which is why you have the Nazis fighting, you know, Bose in the middle, Subhash Chandra Bose, who's one of our freedom fighters, in the middle of you know, a Nazi alternate history and all of those things. And then it obviously time jumps into the present. Then, of course, I mean, you see 2 other comics here, one being Aghori. Aghori is one of those flagship titles for Holy Cow Entertainment. They're like right across from us, and they're here as well. And Aghori follows, I mean, I don't know too much about that title, but Aghori follows the story of, well, Aghori, who is sort of like a ascetic, I guess, that's the word? Yeah. A sadhu, we call it. And he he is this mystical guy who gets powers, and they are, I mean, again, it's semi-mythology. There's basically he has to fight one of the evil lords who's come down and save the earth and all of those things. And he doesn't remember who he is. Then, of course, there's Odayan, which is set in medieval times in India. That was, again, a very good, like, nicely done comic, and it basically follows the story of this rebel warrior who is fighting against a feudal lord, and the entire, I think the pitch is that the fighting scenes and the styles shown are supposedly realistic, and also follow the martial art form which we have down south in Kerala called Alayarapattu, right? That's the word, yeah. So, yeah, that's a brief rundown of the comics going on, and yeah. So... Okay, so yeah, okay, I'll take this segment. So, what the future holds, as in, like, we've been doing this for what, 5 years now? 5 to 6, I guess?
7.
You 7. We were slightly younger than him. So, in that sense, like, in terms of our companies or our labels. But, oh, yeah. There you go.
Talk about your remote. I'll just switch this.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So it's been, you know, when you're at the start of something which is new and which is growing, it's difficult because it's the culture is growing. Well, the money is growing as well, and there's a lot of things happening. I mean, Comic-Con obviously for us is one of the biggest platforms out there, and apart from the event itself, there's a lot of things which go around it. You know, in terms, I mean, yeah. So there we have this big thing which is called the Free Comic Book Weekend earlier, right? So
yeah. So basically, the idea is that it's just not Comic-Con; it's an entire ecosystem, just like you guys are trying to build here, which supports not just comics but anything in geekdom, from cosplay to action figures to just being passionate about TV shows and movies, and that whole idea of having a culture where people who have similar likes get together, become friends, share their thoughts, interests, bitch about stuff, and obviously read comics. And that's something that's been growing, and then creating a community of sorts, which stays not just in one city but all over the country.
So the lower one.
Yep. that was the abridged version of our panel. If you guys have any questions, we'll be free to answer them. Rigged question.
Yes, I do have a question. The parallels are very similar when you were talking about Indian comics, how there used to be this time in the 70s when there was strip comics everywhere and everyone was reading them. And it was the same in Sri Lanka. I don't know if people remember that. And all of a sudden, like by the time we came to the mid-80s, early 90s, they just died away. There used to be at least 10 or 12 of these every week, weeklies that everyone read. And they just died out. And it's only now, in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, with much younger people who are starting to try and do their new comics. So we didn't have satellite TV in like the mid to late 90s here. So I don't know why that happened.
People don't like to read.
But it was just like people in that 15-year period who didn't like to read.
People have ADHD now. They have less time. Picking up a book requires commitment. Giving enough time to kind of finish that book. So for people who are selling comics, it's a struggle how to get someone to convince them. It's not the price actually, it's about the commitment of buying a book. I can buy a t-shirt of the same comic and it's just easy to wear it and walk around. And that thing has just been deteriorating. Even the newspaper guys are no longer really ruling the roost and people don't follow them. We look back to R.K. Narayan, R.K. Lakshman, these are guys, R.K. Lakshman specifically, who's like the greatest cartoonist in India, for newspaper cartoonist. But it's just him, and after that, not everyone knows who came after him, you know, and I'll struggle to name names. So it's just about the moderate commitment and time that people want to give to reading and learning new things, and that's TV, internet, whatever you might call it. But over the past few years, it's been I don't know if to call it a hipster movement or something, but like where people are like, you know what, I'm sick and tired of not giving enough time, so I do want to read books. A lot of the comic books creators, and I've seen, say, Sachi here, who's doing Lionborn, are selling it as a niche product. It's not cheap, it's premium, it requires commitment. So if you're serious about it, you'll go out and buy and read it. So that's something that we're also trying to do in India. And as all South Asians, everyone's price conscious, and we compete with foreign comics, which are much more well established, have movies, branding, everything around it. So, I mean, that's always going to be there, but, you know.
Okay, so that actually leads to my next question that I wanted to ask you. Because there's such a well-established market and stuff like that in Western comics, how did you manage to do that breakthrough to like get yourself out to the market, get yourself noticed? I mean, what were the major obstacles in actually becoming a comics creator and getting out there into the market?
They did it themselves. They put their own money in it. They publish it themselves. So that's one, but they can tell you.
Look, honestly, we didn't really think about it as this is a business I'm getting into. We all started off and we pretty much continue to hold full-time jobs. But we started off with some comics. Jatin Varma's before Comic-Con. That's how we met. I offered to just write a comic for him because he was wanting to publish magazines. And we both had enjoyed comics, and so we decided to give it a try. And by the time we finished making that first comic, he'd already had Comic-Con 1. The biggest thing was for us, we started with the approach that we're going to make this because we really, really want to make comics. We weren't thinking about the size of the audience or whether we needed to be careful about the content or restrict ourselves. We just told the story and the comic we wanted to tell. And it took a while, but surprisingly enough people connected with it that we've actually gained a lot of ground.
Actually, what people at the con here should realize is that most of the guys, your comic, Sachi's, or there's someone else also creating a comic, they're really rare because there's only a few hundred copies that are published. And maybe they won't publish ever again. So if you collect it, maybe you'll make $1 million 50 years down the line. You never know. Tilani's comic.
They might be worth something.
Million rupees also, that's not bad.
Million rupees is also fine.
So there's a certain value in collecting it as well. And you can like it or not like it, but it's something new. And that's something we try and push people into. It's not easy to kind of make them curious and be like, oh, it's not a lot of money to try out something. But again, it's a struggle that we also have back home where we can only sell so much. And what do you do the entire year? The Comic-Con's maybe 10 days in a year. What after that? What about 350 days? So yeah, it's just about building the community and trying to educate people to buy comics. If you guys would like to check out their comics, they're at booth 51, right next to Lion Bond. And there's also another publisher from India, Holy Cow Comics. He has a pretty decent lineup as well, so you guys should come check it out. They're really cheap, and we're giving them away because we have to shut shop soon. So you should certainly,
I used to collect comics of the early era, like the Amar Chitrakatha. I basically learned Hinduism through that. And I know some Hindus who actually quite ashamed, not ashamed to say that, but they learned Hinduism from those comics. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a very clean version of Hinduism.
You might be surprised to know that for many of us in India, the comics were pretty much where we learned about Hinduism as well. We didn't really have parents teaching us as such because it's not that sort of formal a religion in that sense compared to a lot of them. And you don't have going to church or going to the temple or going to the mosque. You do it at home at certain times a year. So the comics actually taught us a hell of a lot more than you would.
Yeah, but you should check out the comics at our place as well.